Hello and welcome to Count Me In. I'm Adam Larson, and today we're joined by a special guest, Chris Papin, owner of Papin CPA, and a beacon in the financial and legal realm. Our episode zeroes in on the duties of advisors in a complex and changing world. Chris will share his wisdom gained from his tenure at Papin CPA on guiding clients through uncertainty, thriving during challenging times like the pandemic, and the continued relevance of the ethical human advisor in an AI-driven age. Expect a rich dialogue on setting client expectations, balancing emotions with sound financial advice, and the importance of integrity in the industry. Tune in for an enlightening session with Chris Papin. Let's dive in. Chris, we're so excited to have you on the podcast today. And as we're going to be talking about, the three pillars of the ethical trusted advisor, and especially in the context of the accountant, maybe we can start off by explaining the scope of shaping that role, the ethical trusted advisor. That's a handful to say, isn't it?
It is. It is. First and foremost, thank you. A great opportunity. I appreciate the willingness to have the chat. And then let me start with, I wear a lot of hats. I've got a CPA firm, I've got a law firm, I've got an insurance license. We do some other things outside of that, just in the sense of general business. My family are small business owners. So when it comes to scope, you can start to understand why I focus there.
Yeah.
What am I hired for? What is the expectation that goes with it? And I think COVID kind of put this on illustration for financial professionals, where perhaps a business qualifies for a certain provision based on the advice of one person, but maybe not based on the advice of another. So I always look through the lens, what do my clients want? What is the expectation first? And a lot of times in the financial world, clients know what they think they want. So you get to translate for them into what they meant, into technical terms, if you will. So somewhere inside of this, what does it mean? At the end of the day, it's making sure that there's clarity around who you are as the service provider, who the client is, because maybe it's the small business, maybe it's the small business owner, maybe it's some combination of businesses. And then making sure that what they want and need line up to what you're good at and what you intend to help people with. So running joke, simple analogy, you don't go to McDonald's and order a pizza. So don't do that to a tax and accounting professional. And naturally, I wear more than one hat. So if you hire my CPA firm, I am not your lawyer. If you hire my law firm, I am not your CPA. But it creates a good dialogue point, because I think folks actually start to think about, what do I want, rather than, oh, it's numbers you deal with. Which is tough, right?
That is very tough. Well, especially if you're within, if you're part of a firm that's offering services, but if you're an accountant within an organization, you still have to look at it that way, because a lot of times people look at the accounting team as that team over there and not the kind of the business partner, that trusted partner, the advisor that they should be. Whether you're a CPA firm offering your services out or you're an internal accounting team, whatever it is, you still have to look at it from that perspective.
Oh, you bet. And I go back to that translator analogy I gave a minute ago. Numbers are the language of business.
Yeah.
I mean, most businesses are out to achieve a goal. They've got revenue streams, or they've got financial benchmarks. How you account for that matters.
Yeah.
And there's your translation. You need the numbers dorks like me around to help translate to, did your marketing goals generate the revenue that you intended? Sometimes there's not a direct correlation. So getting the right stakeholders in that conversation is really important.
It is really important. So what are some challenges that you face as you're kind of setting up those boundaries with your clients? Because you need to set up those parameters as you're learning to translate, learning to connect with them. How do you set up those boundaries? And are there common challenges that people face as they're trying to set that up?
Well, first is kind of a client learning story. You got to know who you serve. You got to make sure that what you do, or in our case, what we try to serve, are small businesses and small business owners.
Yeah.
I don't want to misconstrue that we are some version of a fractional CFO. We are an external accountant. That is different than what a fractional CFO may offer. So making sure that you're lining up what does the client want to what you do is kind of step number one for me. Be a big enough person to say it doesn't fit if it doesn't fit.
Yeah.
There's lots of great professionals out there. But on the other side of it, defining scope and making sure that the kind of folks are in boundaries. For a lot of small business owners, tax and accounting stuff is, it's maintenance. It's required by the government. It's that I have to do it. So I don't want to deal with this. I'm a sales guy or I'm a technician in my business. I want to make widgets or something. So realigning that principle, being forward looking, being a advisor, if you will. We speak about advisory services as opposed to maintenance services. Maintenance, the stuff you got to do. Mm-hmm. That's what keeps your car running. If you don't put gas in, there is no gas. If you don't file a tax return, there is no business.
True.
What business owners really want is that forward look. They don't drive while they're looking out their rearview mirror. They look through the windshield. So they need somebody that has this perspective of all that maintenance info, but is also sitting with them at that board of directors table in navigating, we call, again, all my quips, we call it a top 10 list or goals or whatever it is that the clients are looking at. But then let's have a collective conversation about how we can help you achieve those goals. If there's steps to hire our firm to do, create a change order. There's your scope conversation. If there's steps you need to hire somebody else to do, great. Hire them. There's usually not crossover when you hire somebody else, but internally to businesses, we run into the same problem. The finance folks are notorious for saying, no, you can't spend money on advertising. And the advertising folks are saying, you got to spend more money on advertising. You have to balance those conversations out to make sure that why it's not a function of we're not willing to spend money on advertising. It's that we want to be stewards of the position that we are put in. Mm-hmm. There's particularly for licensed professionals, there's usually a fiduciary duty that goes with that. There's professional ethics standards that go with that. Mm-hmm. And that's important that you meet those, which is very different than kind of where I started this with, hey, you want a second opinion on your COVID stuff? Not everybody was doing that in a legit format. And unfortunately, it got pushed back on licensed professionals that do it for a living. Do you meet the criteria or not? And is somebody testing that criteria? Because I mean it in the nicest way, but most clients don't know what the standards are. If you ask a client, was I impacted by COVID? They'll say yes. But that's not a qualifier. Were you impacted by COVID based on IRS definitions? Different question, right?
Very different question.
It illustrates that subtlety around what is scope, what is my role, what is my job, what do you want it to be? And sometimes you got to say no. That's the reality of it. And it's tough, but you have to.
Well, and it's not easy saying no because you're like, oh, I'm losing business or I want to grow my business. And if I say no, then I won't get that business. And it's that fear factor. And it's kind of over understanding good business decision versus weighing your fear.
Yeah, the fear and emotion, money comes with emotion, whether you like it or not. So naturally in business, emotion creeps in despite what everybody will try to say and keeping emotion out. But it's particularly with financial decisions.
Yeah.
What we may want is to be the number one person in our industry or be the number one brand in our area. What we can afford might be something very different. We watch a lot of small business owners make personal decisions like buy a boat or want a larger home for their family or these are great ideas because they're vesting in bringing their family together, experiences. But if the business is the thing that funds that, now you're in a funding competition between your family and your business. That's not an easy decision. And as a business owner, we don't know what's best sometimes. So helping reason through that and pulling on experience, my running joke, and you'll find I got tons of quips as we go through, right? You've already gotten like 5 or 6, but my running joke is, hey, Adam, I have an investment for you. I need $100,000 from you. What do you think? Interested?
What are we investing?
Okay. So you're going to get this thing and you're really going to like this thing. It's shiny. It's pretty. Everybody's going to comment on it. The catch is at the end of year 1, it's going to be worth $80,000. And at the end of year 2, probably 70, maybe 65. The end of year 3, it could be 50.
Sounds like a car.
By the way, there may be a surprise tax bill when you sell it, but what do you think now?
Sounds like I'm buying a car.
You are buying a car.
Okay.
And you're spot on. Most people will say, why on earth would I do that?
Yeah.
And obviously with your wisdom and experience in this area, you knew exactly where I'm going, but every client we have says they want to build wealth or they want to work towards the future, but in the next vein says, I want to buy a depreciating asset. So I tell the whole story to get back to, how do you tell somebody that you told me one decision was to grow wealth and another decision is going to directly impact that.
Yeah.
That's where I'm not saying no. I'm illustrating two different paths and two competing scenarios. Business owner's choice. It's always the business owner's choice. But let me show you, let me illustrate to you the good, the bad, and the ugly. Now, if I said it were a Range Rover, like a G-Wagon or something like that, people park up and they're like, oh, it's shiny. That's a status symbol. At what cost?
Yeah. At what cost? Well, and like I have my oldest child is starting to drive, and I was explaining to her, like, you may want a really expensive car, but you always remember, can I maintain an expensive car? Because you might be able to buy a Mercedes, but can you maintain having that Mercedes for many, many years, because the cost of maintenance, all that stuff, the parts are more expensive, et cetera, et cetera. And then therefore you have to understand what the long-term vision of buying that thing is. And something clicked when I said that.
It's interesting how we tease internally. We call these fables.
Mm-hmm.
You know, kind of the childhood fable that they've got to be simple enough that a young child can understand, but complex enough that it makes sense to adults too.
Of course.
But the analogy hits.
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful one, because as a young person, you know, your daughter's making a choice. Do I want A or B?
Mm-hmm.
That's what business owners get to do all day, every day. And we want to do it with them with the right parameters. How am I supposed to help somebody make that decision if I'm not hired or engaged to look at the future looking conversation?
Mm-hmm.
It's so hard to do in a silo. I can tell you what everybody else made a decision on.
Mm-hmm.
I can tell you statistically what doesn't make sense. That's not what people want to know. How does it impact me?
Yeah. Well, when you're a small business, numbers are very important, because sometimes you're making decisions based on whatever's in your bank account because you're that small.
Yeah.
And you have to make very strategic decisions. So it's very hard to make those impactful decisions because it's risky.
It is. And you get all kinds of good advice. And you know, we were teasing earlier about TikTok. People watch TikTok all the time. And you know, hey, my neighbor said I should, or I saw a TikTok video on.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not to say that advice is not wrong or correct. There's a lot of good material on all of the different social channels that get people started, but they don't see the perspective as how it applies to you. They don't see the bigger goal. They don't see that larger advisory standard, is the way I'm going to say it. And I know a lot of folks in the industry are really trying to shift, especially getting clients off of kind of a commodity-based exchange into that value-based conversation. But every client I talk to
Mm-hmm.
wants the something more. They just don't know how to ask for it.
Yeah.
Then there's another question around, can we afford it and does it make sense, and all of those other things too. But, you know, layers to that onion that we have to unpack with folks.
For sure. So when we're talking about being an ethical, trusted advisor, you know, especially in the accounting world, you know, IMA has their ethical professional practices. You know, NASBA has the ethics requirements for people who are CPAs. So all the different accounting bodies have their ethical requirements. But when you're in the trenches and, you know, somebody comes up to you and says, hey, I need these numbers to work, you're like, well, I can't just make the numbers change all of a sudden. You're faced with many challenges, especially having to tell the truth. And sometimes that truth doesn't look good.
Yeah. Especially during COVID too, right?
Yes, especially during COVID.
So the one example that I'll give, there was COVID loans, the EIDL loans.
Yes.
And they had a very narrow use that was permitted with them. And universally, everywhere, this is not just me and our profession. I know CPA firms, accounting firms all over the nation were fighting this battle because it's a 30-year fixed 2.75% business loan.
Wow.
Who's not going to sign up for that?
Yeah.
But what's the catch on the other side? What are you going to use it for? And there was a lot of chatter, and we're still kind of in the gray, if you will, about how are you going to prove it? What are you going to go through the battle with? And the way I used it as an analogy was, hey, they've given you a baseline, and you know, try to keep this neutral for all audience members, but I have what I call a clean hands test. Can you stand up and look as if you have clean hands at the end of it? If you took on the loan and you did all the things you were supposed to do and check the box, buying PPE, supporting your team, keeping people employed, paying the rent, all the things you were supposed to do. Maybe there's some other variables in there that weren't directly applicable, but were a result of COVID. Cool. I'm all for it. But if you took on the loan and all of a sudden have 7 more locations, I don't think that's the way it was supposed to work. That does not look like you have clean hands.
Yeah.
So by analogy, I spoke with most folks. And then sometimes you got to use it at fear factor. We had a few people that wanted to be aggressive, and I just reminded them, first and foremost, I am not hired as legal counsel. However, Even if I were, I do not have the resources of the US Department of Justice. Oh, yeah, that's an endless fund.
Yeah.
Sometimes you just have to give some sticker shock. There are scenarios where it's gray. And where it's gray, we talk about audit proofing.
Okay.
And going through a process based on the data that was available at the time. Did you make a good faith effort to comply? I've never known anybody to get in trouble when they made a good faith effort.
Yeah.
You don't have to be perfect. Here, I just did the best I could under the circumstance. So those are a couple of ways that we kind of try to talk folks through. You know, inevitably lenders and things like that want income. Well, as a taxpayer, you don't. Those are competing interests. We educate folks on kind of the goods, the bads, but what I have found is folks don't cheat. They're not really wanting to cheat. They just don't have an understanding of the principles.
Yeah.
So once it's clear what's going on, for example, I bought my G-Wagon and I took it as depreciation. So my income looks a lot less. Guess what? The bank doesn't care. They're going to add that back. They know that is a non-cash item. Oh, well, if that's the case, then I think we're okay. So that's kind of my paradigm. Now, I fully understand there's a whole different set, but as we onboard folks, we flat tell them we don't lie, we don't cheat, we don't steal. If you're even close to that, in the conversation now. And I think most licensed professionals do the same thing.
Yeah.
Now, I want to touch on one quick thing. You mentioned like all the different governing bodies. There are a lot of layers, but licensed professionals kind of know where that is. And what I have found, the more and more I go with different reputable licensed folks, there's also what I'm going to call a true north. It's not necessarily a moral or like a religious or anything like that. It's just, we know what happens with successful business owners, and we're going to follow that path. We're going to pattern success. We're not going to pattern failure. So sometimes that ends up an easier way to say you could go down that road, but the other 7 people that just went down that road had these hurdles in front of them. If you don't like those hurdles, perhaps choose a different exit.
I like that. Because it's one of those things where there's so many different situations that you find yourself in as a professional, whether you're running a business or whether you're running a system, whether you're CPA, CMA, whatever certification you have, whatever governing body you agree to, there's so many situations and things are constantly changing and it's hard to stay on top of that. So all the more important that as professionals that we need to stay up with our continuing education, make sure we understand the changing of the laws. And so how do you balance that to make sure that you said that clean hands test, but you're like, but everything I'm dealing with seems to be gray and I feel like I have gray matter all over my hands. How do I fix that? Where's that balance there?
It's hard. I mean, one of the things that I lean on, and in particular during, I'm using COVID as the example repetitively just because it was an unprecedented time.
Of course.
From 1986 to like 2017, there were 4 or 5 major tax law changes. And then in 2021, there were 4 or 5 major tax law changes. It's one of those, like, I think it was January 18th. No, it was March 18th when the first major COVID legislation hit. I checked voicemail that weekend and I already had 2 messages at like 9 p.m. that night. Hey, I saw on the news. Like, guys, I haven't even printed the law and you're asking me what it is. So what I have chosen to do and what I think helps people understand is talk a little bit about the learning process. Talk a little bit about how I go through my process of gaining information. We're plugged into a nationwide network of folks that do something similar to we do. Having conversations with guys like you, making sure that everybody is pulled together. And as an industry, we kind of see a pattern here. We don't know if it's correct or not, but this is the pattern that we see today. And I think this is a for real thing we did. We shared, the old YouTube video about the piece of paper, like how a bill becomes a law.
Yeah.
We reminded people that if it's one house or the other, stop listening because it's going to change 15 times. Worry about it once it's been signed by the president. So that process kind of reiterated social studies 101 in a sense, but here's how we get our information. Here's the path we go on. Sometimes buying time is in your favor. You don't need to be the guinea pig. Now, in other instances, my style was, I don't know all the ins and outs. I'll help you with the full disclaimer of here's what I know to date, but I can't know all of it because final regulations are not issued. So we have the conversation, you paper that up like any normal process. Most folks got it, especially during those times. So now with instant on-demand information. I mean, there's, you can ask Microsoft Copilot any tax question you want. It'll get it right about 40% of the time. But with that level of information, I think there's where the collaboration process, communication is the biggest key in that, making sure everybody's at the table. It's not just as simple as a yes, no question.
Yeah, it's not.
Most good clients vest with you in that process. And the way I will say it is if the client isn't, they weren't my client to begin with.
There's one thing that you said as we were preparing for this, that interactions with, clients, it's like that. It's not all rainbows and unicorns, and we have to be flexible. And maybe you can expound upon that a little bit about not being all rainbows and unicorns.
Yeah, the clickbait is rainbows and unicorns, right? But
yeah,
sometimes it's sunny outside, sometimes it's cloudy, sometimes you slip on the ice and the ice and snow falls on your head. That's just the nature of the beast. So we tokened it rainbows and unicorns, just having fun, but the reality is that if you are in business, you're going to get IRS notices. Something wrong is going to go along. I mean, life is this way. You have ups and downs and ebbs and flows. So part of what we try to vest folks in is a conversation. If you can't have a hard conversation with your professional advisor, I don't need to be your professional advisor. If you don't trust me to tell me the negative and work our way through it, I don't know what we're doing. Because that long relationship there, what do you do when you're in a car accident, you ended up addicted to pain meds, your wife takes the kids and moves out, your business is failing and you've got an IRS lien? What do you do? Nobody wants to have that conversation.
Yeah.
But I said this and somebody knows the scenario or has had some pattern similar in their life. And hopefully whoever we're representing in that paradigm gets the help they need to overcome the hurdles. But the infrastructure is not set up only for success. So the best analogy I like to give here is Tom Brady's the GOAT to me. And he proved it because he was losing a Super Bowl by the most points ever and came back and won. He didn't abandon his principles. He didn't change teams. He didn't quit. They didn't run new plays. They found a way to execute and overcome. And that's what business owners need to go do whenever it's not all of the positive things. You make decisions now when it's good to protect yourself when it's bad. You don't just buy more Range Rovers.
I really like that. Make decisions now when it's good so that you're prepared for the bad. And I think in business and life, that's a great thing. Just in thinking of just life decisions you're making. If things are going well, make sure you're preparing for when things aren't so well. And that's a decision like for when you're going through life, when you're in a business, like that's something that everybody should be thinking about, because not everything's going to be going well, because there's good times and there's bad times. You have to prepare for both.
You bet. You bet. I mean, that's just the reality of it all. Your daughter took defensive driving courses at some point, right?
Not quite yet. I've been her driving course instructor, basically.
Okay, so inside of there, I'm willing to bet at some point you recommended that she break sooner just in case.
Yes.
No different. That's what we're trying to go. You can go insurance poor, spending money on every risk that could be there, but make those strategic decisions so you have control, rather than being at the mercy of the car that's in front of you.
I like that. So, let's say you're new to this and you're like, hey, I want to get into this business of being a business advisor, being that trusted ethical advisor. What advice would you give to somebody just getting in and like they want to manage those expectations properly and have transparency as they get into these complex business situations that we've been discussing?
First and foremost, a lot of your podcast guests have said this too. So I'm not unique, and we've all heard this, but you need to have clarity of vision on what you're doing. You need to know your why, to put it in Simon Sinek terms. If you know what you're supposed to go in and do, then you can help guide folks. Now, I want to be clear in that. I am not at all pretending I know everything about everything, because I don't.
Yeah.
But I do know what my role should be. I sit at the board of directors with the small businesses and the small business owners that we represent, and we discuss and we lay out options. And that might mean that we need to do some homework on a new scenario that came up. Cryptocurrency 10 years ago wasn't a thing.
Yeah.
Now you can accept Bitcoin payments through online apps. And I've got lots of clients that are saying, hey, should I do this? Does it make sense? So this is one of those where I didn't know, but we've got to figure out, how do you report it? Is it appropriate? Does it make sense? What's going on with all of the different reporting mechanisms? And then debate it for a business unit. I would argue that if you are a small business that maybe deals in things that are borderline appropriate or not, say a medical marijuana dispensary. You're legal, it's legit in your state. Probably Bitcoin's not the thing to do. It's going to look like you don't have clean hands. But as a restaurant, who cares? So those nimble things, first and foremost, you got to know what you're doing. Second, you've got to be willing to learn, and you got to be willing to adapt, or say, this is outside my scope. We need to go find somebody else that this is their expertise. Or sometimes, and I'm probably the first of this, just because we're a relatively small shop. All of my family stuff has always been relatively small shops. We're good at what we do. We're really good at what we do, but we don't know what we don't know in a lot of instances. So let's just stop here and let me go find you a resource. And if you want me to sit next to you and translate what that resource says, that's probably the strongest thing as a business advisor you can go do. You don't have to be the expert. You can work with the expert, maybe pick up from the expert some new skill sets so that you can expand your representation as you go forward. And then communicate until your face turns blue. Because no matter how many times you go through it, like adult learning, there's kind of a mantra about tell, teach, tell. Well, my experience with clients is you can do that, and then they'll forget it until you tell, teach, tell again, because they're not worried about the technical thing all day, every day like you are. So making sure that everybody kind of knows, why did I recommend that you shouldn't buy that vehicle? Because you told me you were behind on your retirement goals, and I don't see how taking on an auto loan advances your retirement goals. There's that. It's small, but don't just say, no, I don't think you should buy the vehicle, because they're going to say, my neighbor said I could save a bunch of taxes doing it. Your neighbor's correct. You could. Let's talk about all the other things you're giving up in exchange for that tax savings. Which one makes more sense for you? Subtle, but I think important.
I like that, finding the right partners so that you can see the big picture properly.
Yeah.
Because we as individuals may not be able to see the whole big picture, but it's surrounding yourself with the right people so that you can be informed properly to see the big picture in the right way. And as a business owner or as a professional, that is the best way to go forward and to be successful.
And I mean, as a finance professional inside an organization, I was picking on advertising earlier, but there is no better lead source for a lot of businesses than social right now. They cannot measure dollars directly to the advertising. It's softer than that. They can measure clicks. They can measure people in the pipeline. They can measure, phone calls, things like that. But it's never, I spent 10,000, therefore I got 100,000. I wish.
Hey, that would be great.
But to your analogy in that scenario, right? You got to bring the right stakeholders to the table so we can see and talk about all the different variables and draw some professional conclusions about, maybe the spend is 10,000 to get 100,000. I don't know. If it is, by all means, sign me up for that gig. There's more to it than that. It's never that simple. And yeah, seeing the big picture is hard. And none of us can do it.
No.
We all have different perspectives and lenses and experiences to pull on. The more of those you can get, the better you can get. Then there's that cost benefit analysis. How much time do we have to analyze it, and how much money do we want to spend on it? The clients usually got maybe an hour a week at best that they're going to give you in these scenarios. So you got to distill that stuff back down to those basic driving analogies that we're having so much fun with.
We are having so much fun with those. I like to wrap these conversations. This has been a great conversation. I kind of like to wrap these up as, if you had a crystal ball and you were looking into the future, how do you see this trusted advisor role evolving into the future? Especially we've got changing technologies. You mentioned, Copilot, there's generative AI, there's so many things happening and it's so fast. How do you see this role evolving as we look toward the future?
So where I kind of go with most of my clients, most of the professionals that I talk to, it kind of boils down to the analogy around the language learning models, all of the different AI or automations. Sometimes I think we misplace vocab there, but the processes that are in place are based on data that is typically historic data. It can identify trends. It can show patterns. It can show qualifications and things like that we had to do manually. Nobody can predict the future, nor can any of these technologies.
Yeah.
They can show trends about the future. In deciding which trend fits the business or the client or the family, that's really where I see the secret science. And it's not going to be as crystal clear as, AI said do this, so go do this. How do you go do that? That's the next piece. I tease folks all the time. Nobody's going to go do it for you.
Yeah.
You've got to go do it. And that's where I think the infrastructure steps in. That's where I think an advisor really will shine going forward is, number one, of the three decisions we've got in front of us, what makes the most sense? And then number two, what is the path? What are the pieces to execute on to ensure as much success as possible? Because I don't know if you're like me. First thing I do half the time is Google it. And then Google will give me the framework so I know what vocab term to use, but it never tells the whole story.
Of course.
And that's where your advisor is going to shine through. They're going to tell the rest of the story and pull from the experience and give it a little extra guidance and pull the audible when it's not rainbows and unicorns and help you overcome to go the other direction.
Yeah. Well, Chris, I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast, sharing your knowledge. This has been a great conversation, and I really hope our audience enjoyed it as much as I have.
Thank you again for the opportunity. I've enjoyed every minute of it.
This has been Count Me In, IMA's podcast, providing you with the latest perspectives of thought leaders from the accounting and finance profession. If you like what you heard and you'd like to be counted in for more relevant accounting and finance education, visit IMA's website at www.imanet.org.